This is about education, school reform, school choice, and charter schools. And stories.
The path to being a good filmmaker is not about the equipment or the technique, it's about stories.
It's been about 10 years now since the documentary Waiting for Superman came out. Whether its influence was large or small, the film typified a huge turning point in education policy in the US. It helped ignite a national movement to scrutinize public schools and spark protracted debates around school choice, teachers' unions, accountability, and privatization. But it wasn't just a policy shift. The reform movement was also a narrative shift on how we understood inequality and social mobility. This essay continues with a look at billionaires and their elite inner circles, and how they were able to sell their own worldview to the public through the power of story, through fairy tales of inspirational figures and entrepreneurial acumen to convince the rest of us that they held the key to fixing education. It was the 1980s, and there was a growing sense that our schools weren't what they once were. They were slipping toward mediocrity, grown too complacent and bureaucratic. Some folks like Reagan and economists like Milton Friedman sought to fix this by handing over elements of education to the private sector. Albert Shanker, the then president of the largest teachers' union in the country, had a different idea. He too saw mediocrity in the system, but in 1988 he proposed a compromise. Create a small laboratory within every public school for the teachers. Give them a space for creative freedom to incubate good ideas on how to teach more effectively without the constraints of mandated curriculum. The idea seemed to please both ends of the political spectrum. The term charter school was coined. It is a strange historical origin story because it wasn't a bunch of free market evangelists who made it up. The idea came from teachers' unions. But in the 1990s, after seeing a wave of new charter school laws make it to the books, Albert Shanker quickly turned against his own idea. He felt that it had been co-opted by a fixation on competition and accountability, a, quote, mechanical gimmick to let private control creep into education. But by then, it was too late. The charter school movement had officially begun.
It's called Waiting for Superman, and it's been called everything from an eloquent scrutiny of the school system to an insult to educators. Do you think you portray charter schools as too much of a panacea?
I make it clear only 1 in 5 charters are doing better than others. But those high-performing charters, we can't dismiss that it is a revolution because they're sending a lot of them, more than 90% of their kids to college, and they hold the ingredients to success, and it's not that complicated.
Charters are publicly funded schools under private control, with the idea that they run better when operating outside normal public school regulations and away from teachers' unions. The last few decades saw a massive expansion in charter enrollment. So what's been the verdict? Are charter schools better than public schools? The answer is not really. There is a lot of literature on this. Study after study after study has been done on charter school performance. Depending on the institution and how much ideological skin they have in the game, you'll see a range of results. Charter performance can be both better and worse than public schools. I think it is safe to say that, though, given the aggregate of these studies, you cannot reliably say that charter schools are a superior system, and the evidence mostly indicates that the average charter is simply on par with public schools. So I'm not here to disprove the effectiveness of charters. Rather, I want to dispense with the idea that charters are clearly better because of this nebulous idea of free market accountability.
The singular thing that has to change is one of accountability. There is no accountability and I'm not pointing at teachers now, I'm pointing at the system. Right. A charter school doesn't perform, they close it.
It was no secret that CEO of Participant Media wanted Waiting for Superman to bring business principles to education through charter schools.
What business can you survive in which you can do the same thing every year, fail at it, and then take a couple months off to rest, and then do the exact same thing again?
Let's take a look at the absolute best charter schools have to offer, including those featured in Waiting for Superman. Schools like KIPP Academy and Harlem Children's Zone can indeed boast some impressive successes. High performance metrics, rates of proficiency, rates of graduation, etc. And when you look inside, they do seem to employ some rather impressive outside-the-box methods, especially for students hailing from more disadvantaged backgrounds.
That is to say, as long as you're okay with environments of militaristic discipline.
Go to the calm down chair and sit.
I want to be as charitable as possible to these examples, though, especially to see if their successes are truly the result of being disciplined by the market. One way to look at the effect of market accountability is performance. While markets supposedly incentivize charters to do well, it also seems to incentivize them to massage their performance numbers. The superstar charters like KIPP tout high performance numbers, but a study done a year after Waiting for Superman found KIPP took on fewer kids with disabilities and fewer kids learning English as a second language. Though lottery systems presumably guarantee that charters cannot pick their students, the desire and ability to cheat a little is always here and there, especially if failing metrics spells the end of your business. Charters in general have often been criticized for keeping the number of their hardest to educate special needs kids as low as possible to pad their success numbers. It's a practice known as creaming.
Do charter schools cream?
It's complicated. First of all, look, I'm a charter advocate. I work in a charter school, but I'm clear-eyed about these things. I think it's naive for charter advocates to say, no, we don't cream.
Harlem Children's Zone was able to boast a 100% graduation rate.
So what is the high school dropout rate at Harlem Children's Zone?
Well, John, 100% of our kids graduated high school last year in my school. 100% of them went to college.
But only because its founder, Geoffrey Canada, who was the closest thing to Superman in Waiting for Superman, kicked out entire classes of underperforming middle schoolers who could not get their test scores up. Want to keep your graduation rate at 100%? Simple. Don't give your most difficult students the opportunity to graduate. The other market accountability issue is efficiency. Charters sometimes boast low per-pupil spending rates. The suggestive narrative here is that charters represent a lean, business-minded approach to administration in favor of wasteful, bureaucratic, government-run administration, and that this clears the way for more efficient investments in the kids. Back to KIPP Academy. The same study found that KIPP supplements whatever they get from the government with private revenue, say from billionaire philanthropists, like the one sitting on their board of directors. Harlem Children's Zone also benefits from the good graces of billionaire financiers. Again, ask reform hero and founder Geoffrey Canada, who flexed his alumni connections from Bowdoin to secure funding from hedge fund billionaire Stanley Druckenmiller.
I told him what I was doing. I said, well, yeah, I'm having a hard time finding money. He said, well, you know anybody? I'm going to Bowdoin. He said, well, do you know Stan Druckenmiller? I said, no. He said, Stan Druckenmiller has more money than God.
In D.C., Michelle Rhee's territory, 8 of the city's 100 charters received 75% of all charitable dollars. In fact, look at every charter school golden child, and you will see that their boards of directors are not populated with experienced education experts and professionals, but huge streams of donor dollars allow them to compensate their executives handsomely. If you look at executive salaries for KIPP, for example, they start at $500,000. Harlem Children's Zone's exec pay starts as high as $1 million downward. Beside this point, if you're truly business-minded, why do the ingredients for success depend so heavily on wealthy donor money? Okay, what about the thousands of less prominent charter schools that aren't given Hollywood publicity and don't have billionaire connections? A study done in 9 states showed that administrative costs for charters are actually higher, leaving less for instruction, student support, and teacher salary. Whether your school is a nonprofit or for-profit entity, the market tendency always maximizes profits for leadership, while subordinate staff like teachers and counselors get whatever remains. Where's the efficiency in that? A frequent pro-market argument is if charters fail, that's okay. At least the market allowed them to do so for underperformance. The system sheds its failure and is better off for it. And if you buy into this premise that free markets and competition allowed KIPP and Harlem Children's Zone to succeed, you'll need to also justify that their models of quality probably cannot be scaled up to service every child in America. At the very least, they have yet to prove they can replicate their success without having the time, talent, treasure, and networks of the hedge fund billionaires. If only there were enough hedge fund billionaires to go round. Maybe you don't think charters are the answer. Maybe you thought that charters are simply the minimum requirement to open up the door for school systems to succeed. Then you shouldn't be surprised if, by opening that door, a whole bunch of failure walked in and you're left wondering whether it was worth it to open the door in the first place. Marketization just reproduces the same inequalities inherent in the system.
How could we have known?
The quality of charters has really run the gamut from creative, innovative, and productive to negligent, self-dealing, and corrupt. Michigan, where the DeVos family, of Donald Trump education secretary fame, had reigned to push for more charters and more privatization, and fell heavily on the failing end of the spectrum.
My hope is not that one does better than the other. My hope is that they all do well.
Mm-hmm. The nature of competition, though, is not everyone wins.
The nature of competition in education is that potentially everybody wins.
And I don't even have enough time to scratch the surface of damage from virtual charters who saw massive enrollment, sometimes with literally zero results.
Because one major study found compared to kids in traditional public schools, students in online charters lost the equivalent of 72 days of learning in reading and 180 days in math during the course of a 180-day school year. And 180 minus 180 is, as those kids might put it, 3.
The CEO of K-12 Incorporated, Ron Packard, was the highest paid educator in the country at $19 million in compensation between 2009 and 2013, when only 24% of its virtual schools satisfied state performance ratings. Where's the free market accountability in that? To many people with skin in this fight, the question of charter schools is actually a proxy for a different question. Does privatization work? Especially when the thing you're privatizing serves an important social function. The answer? If you're looking for free market accountability and efficiency for important social functions, don't look toward charter schools. Yet you'll find no shortage of heavily partisan ideological groups who are absolutely convinced. Reason TV won't shut up about it, cherry-picking successful charters as solid proof of marketization. And at some point, they tried to take down Matt Damon's mom.
10% that are bad, though? 10% of teachers are bad.
Where'd you get that number?
I don't know. 10% of people in any profession maybe should think of something else.
Well, okay, but I mean, maybe you're a shitty cameraman. I don't know.
And let's not forget our other institutions of academia and rigorous peer-reviewed research. PragerU won't shut up about this either. The makers of Waiting for Superman would probably be the first to tell you that they don't have a dog in the free market fight.
It's so politicized that people are going to say the film is pro this, anti this. The film is really not that. It's about how do we find a great school for every kid.
But if you look at the message of their movie and their larger media campaign, it's hard not to see how they've become, at the very least, unwitting enablers of a bad idea, of an ideological approach not fit to solve a problem as complex as education. At worst, it fueled a misconception around the actual power that teachers have to influence outcomes. Even worse, fueled a stereotype of teachers being tenured bureaucrats, lazy administrators, overall the welfare queens of the educational system. Are union policies, teacher tenure, generous seniority protections problematic? Actually, yeah, I do believe so, but it's hard to call attention to those things when it meant towing the reformist argument that the anti-market forces were the source of America's failing education system. Well, the reform movement, through charter schools, had their chance to prove that to you, at least up until now. They really haven't come up with much to show for it. Reform movement critic Diane Ravitch put it best.
These principles don't work in schools for the same reason that they don't work for families, churches, and other institutions that function primarily on the basis of human interactions, not profits and losses.
I did not. Oh, hi, Mark.
It was summer of 2010 at the annual gathering of millionaires and billionaires in the posh resort and mountain lodges of Sun Valley, Idaho, population of about 1,500. No press allowed in, no publicity. The secluded affair for the ultra-wealthy is invitation only. For elites to pair business with your peers with the pleasure of getting away from it all. It was there Mark Zuckerberg, of Facebook fame, meets Cory Booker, then mayor of Newark, New Jersey. Made aware of each other through mutual connections to Sheryl Sandberg, of Facebook and Lean In fame, and sharing the table with the likes of Jeff Bezos, of fame. Booker and Zuckerberg would later take a scenic walk alone, where Booker then could make his pitch. How would you like to be... I can't. How would you like to be a savior of one of the most troubled school districts in the United States? I have a portfolio of wealthy philanthropists ready to double whatever you give. Are you with me, Mark?
Republican Governor Chris Christie, Democratic Mayor of Newark, Cory Booker, and the founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, are putting politics aside to help turn around the failing public schools in Newark, New Jersey.
Yeah, I've committed to starting the Startup Education Foundation, whose first project will be a $100 million challenge grant.
$100 million.
This alliance of Zuckerberg and Booker and the army of reformers ushered in to revolutionize the Newark education system was chronicled in Dale Russikoff's book, The Prize. It was like a sequel for Waiting for Superman to show what happens when the movie's advertised cure finally gets applied to one of the most ailing education systems. The Oprah appearance was timed with the release of Waiting for Superman, in fact, and with much fanfare. With publicity came momentum. More philanthropy dollars came flowing from Bill Gates, as well as other hedge funders and tech billionaires.
Dude, you're getting it, yeah.
The beauty of philanthropy is that it doesn't need public review. It can't get jammed up in committee. You have the money. You can do whatever you pay people to do. With this money, they could achieve their goal of making Newark, quote, the charter school capital of the nation. Move fast and break things, Mark once said. And that was the reformers' mantra. If you worry about getting consensus from community or from local leaders, you're falling into the same conventional bureaucratic trap that allowed the system to fail in the first place. This time it's different. To hell with your small changes. To hell with your incrementalism. But more for charters meant less for public schools. Good riddance, some might have said. There was no doubt the Newark public school system was suffering from at least a little bit of bloat. But even with their newfound freedom and market accountability, many charters actually innovated their way to being worse than public schools, with unjustifiably bad learning outcomes, financial mishandling, and even basic issues with kids' safety. The infusion of philanthropic monies paved the way for $1,000 per day consultants, some of them tasked with building shiny new data dashboards that many school administrators didn't even use or maintain. Other consultants were brought in to raise even more philanthropic money. And many of these consultants were friends and relatives of those who were doing the hiring. The billionaires, and the politicians who enabled them, got to indulge in their megalomania, their fantasy of proving to the world once and for all that they have innovated the formula to education. All this not understanding that it came at a cost to the parents and kids of Newark through school closures imposed on them with absolutely none of their input along the way. Sure, blame the juggernaut of politics on the lack of progress, but even with the more problem-laden democracies of Newark frickin' New Jersey, there are still some elements of that politic that are tied in with the community's interests, which you simply cannot reform away without any pushback or consequences. Rusikoff.
Put another way, education reform is too important to be left to reformers alone.
$100 million later, in Newark, a city that he had never visited himself, Zuckerberg looks back at this period with regret, acknowledging it was not a success. In fact, it was a lesson learned. Zuckerberg's role gained a bit of notoriety.
Mark Zuckerberg's $100 million failure. Facebook's founder donated a fortune to help turn around Newark, New Jersey's failing schools, but the plan was a flop.
But it paled in comparison to the handful of philanthropists throwing their weight behind school reform. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which supported charter schools and test-based teacher evaluation, the Eli Broad Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, of Walmart fame, funded vouchers and charters, and a host of others. Let's bring this back to documentary film. The wave of philanthropy was just a part of an era where the narrative of education reform was forced on us through the lens of elites. It wasn't just the billionaires on charter school boards. There was an accompanying media blitz led by members of billionaire circles. Waiting for Superman's production company, Participant Media, was founded by billionaire-turned-philanthropist Jeffrey Skoll, of eBay fame. Their mission explicitly states that they are a, quote, leading media company dedicated to entertainment that inspires audiences to engage in positive social change. Look at their movies. You will see Participant reflects the political values of the so-called Hollywood liberal elite, the nightmare essence of culture war Republicans. Themes included corporate power, corruption, environmentalism, sensitization to the plight of refugees.
You are a participant. These are your tears.
Not to say all this is bad. Participant helped mainstream vital conversations, and often with very compelling polish and professionalism. Even though Davis Guggenheim comments more humbly about simply wanting to tell an inspiring story to change hearts and minds, the plans for Waiting for Superman went far beyond that.
As Davis was collecting footage and developing his ideas and concept and in getting a sense of really where the focus of the film would be, we started to coalesce a group of NGOs who are both experts in the reform movement, experts in policy, and now there's about 160 of them actually involved in the social action campaign.
The goal wasn't just to make a motion picture. Waiting for Superman was just one step of an ambitious plan to spark a nationwide movement toward reform, to directly fund the work of charters, and to build coalitions of activists to lobby for policy change. They were confident that they had discovered the key to the education conundrum, and they knew film could move the masses toward one of the boldest policy reform efforts. It wasn't just Participant Media. Rusikoff's book reinforced how charter school propaganda went hand in hand with activist hedge fund professionals. One of them was Ravenel Boykin Curry IV. A documentary, Street Fight, made by Curry's younger brother, Marshall, was nominated for an Oscar in 2005 and became a staple of Booker's political narrative. A documentary released the same year as Waiting for Superman was The Lottery, demonstrating the same tragic charter school lottery process. That film was written, directed, and produced by Madeline Sackler, of Sackler family fame, of Purdue Pharma fame, of opioid epidemic fame. This poses the core problem. We are forced to view complex issues through the prism of elite individuals and to hear out their prescriptions on how poverty and social mobility works.
Where are you from originally?
I'm from Connecticut.
And did you go to high school out there, and if so, where?
I did. I went to Greenwich High School. It's the one public school.
It's safe to say that Greenwich is one of the most, it's one of the richest towns in America.
Yes.
I mean, the people that live there do very well.
And so, really, the world. Yeah, people are very lucky. Yeah.
As benevolent, skilled, and educated as you might assume they are, these folks never truly knew socioeconomic struggle. They never truly knew the disadvantages conferred by things like racism. To drive this point home, I picked up a book by former chancellor of the New York City school system, Joel Klein. He was a pro-charters, anti-union reformer during his time in office.
A mentor and hero of mine, Joel Klein.
His book about education doubled as a memoir of his life, the first few chapters dedicated entirely to a self-promotional retelling of his resume.
With Mr. Harris's encouragement, I applied to Columbia. Informed me that I had won the Joseph Pulitzer call from the White House as deputy counsel to President Clinton. I was gratified that The Economist called me a disarming revolutionary. I suspected Bloomberg I met knew Nicole all this, when Margaret Carlson invited me to the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
His out-of-touchness really came through in the book when boasting how hard he worked through Columbia University, paying his own way through part-time jobs, a situation not remotely possible for today's average student. What's more, even detailing how his request for a $10,000 per month housing stipend got denied by then Mayor Michael Bloomberg. With the exception of Geoffrey Canada and a handful of others, the vast majority of reform movement leaders never experienced poverty, and it is no wonder that their proposed solutions paid little mind to the structural effects on those suffering most from inequality. Fixing a broken system was just a story they could tell themselves as they projected their life experience onto poor kids. In one of his interviews, we get a glimpse into Guggenheim's own experiences in education and social mobility when he tells his story growing up as a dyslexic kid who later managed to get admitted to NYU.
I think very dyslexic, not good in school.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to NYU and then Brown.
Guggenheim is a graduate of Sidwell Friends, an elite private school in D.C., where Sasha and Malia Obama went. He later describes his journey of making it on his own in Hollywood.
I'll give you a quick arc. Yeah. Assistant to somebody, working, small jobs, 10 years, and I finally get my break, and I sold a script that a friend of mine wrote to Warner Brothers. I was going to direct it, my big break. It was a training day with Denzel Washington.
All this he claims without the influence of his father, one of the most honored Academy Award-winning documentarians in history.
Just to follow in his footsteps would have been pathetic for me as an 18-year-old. So I had to go off and make it on my own.
From all these stories, the billionaire-inspired narrative emerges. Reformers don't see socioeconomic segregation and cycles of poverty. They see a less complex America, where everyone starts at zero and where life chances are largely the result of good teachers plus hard work. Waiting for Superman argued that the kids got the working hard part down, so it logically had to come down to lazy teachers depriving them of their potential. But the storytellers have massive blind spots. They overlook the fact that society at large, under which their education existed, may have played a more outsized role in their success. It never occurred to them that maybe it is unsustainable to think that every hardworking kid can receive the same amount of privileged resources and networks that billionaires were afforded. And they have yet to realize that relentlessly peddling this narrative does very little to fix the, quote, system. In fact, it makes them the system. It's 2020. I argue here that the film helped mainstream the issue of accountability through market mechanisms.
It follows more of a capitalistic approach.
This narrative of public sector failure was probably just the momentum needed for longtime advocates of privatization, except they moved off the vouchers idea and saw charter schools as the pragmatic next step. It was a lead-in for the DeVos's educational empire, and Betsy DeVos's ascent as education secretary in a very powerful yet unpopular administration. Apparently before DeVos, Michelle Rhee was pegged for strong consideration under Trump. Public opinion on charters toward the end of the decade has waned, while general confidence in public schools has actually rallied a bit. And for some reason, and despite the bad rap of public schooling, most parents seem satisfied with their own public schools anyways. Makes us wonder how we thought the, quote, system was failing us in the first place. The most prominent charter school champions and proponents have silently faded from the education discourse, including people like Jeffrey Canada, Michelle Rhee, and others. Guggenheim and participant films have not pressed the education reform issue long after Waiting for Superman. The organizations and projects they helped create seem to be no longer. Of course, we can't know for sure if they had relaxed their former positions or still hold steadfast to their ingredients theory. But a microphone hasn't really been shoved into their face as of late. On the philanthropy front, funding for charter school projects and similar programs have likely waned quite a bit. Some of the most ardent and conservative-leaning philanthropists, such as the Philanthropy Roundtable, stated in a recent meeting, quote, "School reformers are getting punched in the face." The kids featured in Waiting for Superman should now be around college age, but there does not seem to be a record or media spotlight showing where they ended up. Given the political heat of reform and the controversy of the documentary, it's probably best that they've stayed out of the spotlight. Please don't make this an excuse to go digging. One of the leading critics of education reform, and turncoat of the movement itself, Diane Ravitch, wrote a bit of a victory lap book on how the reformers in the end got it wrong, in part being evidenced by the mess caused by the lack of public school funding that we find ourselves in today.
We're expected to do more and more for less.
Larger class sizes.
Class sizes. Classroom sizes.
Class sizes.
Class sizes.
Class sizes. Almost everyone I know has a second job.
One representative we talked to, when we asked him point blank if he supported public education, refused to answer that question.
So I need to go. I just need to get out.
The narrative that teaching is a crowded field with only lazy unionized teachers occupying all the available positions falls apart when considering we are now in a nationwide teacher shortage. Do I hate Cory Booker? He's okay. And do I have the answer to what ails education? No. The issue is extremely complicated and will not be solved in however long this video will be tirade. Which was admittedly conceived during a lager taste test my roommate put me up to. What's more interesting is the revealing story it paints on how not to fix inequality. And what I hope to show here is not what the answer is, but what the answer isn't. The idea that free market accountability and billionaire activists will be the things that heal American education. You might be surprised to know that the public versus private debate is not necessarily my axe to grind here. Do I have ideological leanings? Hell yes. I admittedly strongly value democracy and feel public institutions are a very necessary and important piece of that. But I hope to check my most ardent and moralistic views at the door in good faith. My interest here is not on ideology, but the way ideology influences the way we design our institutions, in this case, our schools, our policies, to help rectify the achievement gap, and more broadly, the issue of unequal social mobility. I don't mean to indict the guy. I think Guggenheim's intentions with Waiting for Superman were pure enough. You really did get the sense that he was trying to fight an underlying and often racist assumption that poor kids simply cannot learn. And in fact, that there was this world in front of his camera that disproves that assumption once and for all. But in subsequent interviews about Waiting for Superman, given the controversy it stirred, he doesn't seem to look back on it with the utmost pride and fondness.
I did it again with Waiting for Superman. I mean, that was another movie that really entered the national conversation.
In a different way. I mean, it's a more complicated experience because it had more controversy involved in it.
Interesting, when describing the filming process, he was literally making two separate but parallel films on education.
I literally made 2 one-hour movies, and I kept them separate for more than a year and a half. 2 separate editing rooms, 2 separate stories. One is the kids and their families, just trying to find a great school. In the other editing room, we had what I call the folly of the adults, which is the system. It's like, you know, the centralized bureaucracy, the union pieces, how we got where we are, the charts and graphs, the intellectual system that we've built.
The folly of the adults, or the system.
Because despite what all the adults were always saying and the arguments that we were having, the kids were the ones who had the most insightful, rational, reasonable conversations and debates. I kid you not.
Now that we're 10 years after Waiting for Superman, the last question that remains here is, what makes him so different from the adults? The end of Russakoff's book gives the anecdote of Howard Fuller, the former Milwaukee superintendent and among the first African Americans to become prominent in the education reform movement. When passing through the city on a book tour, he cringes at the reform movement, which he helped push. I think a lot of us education reformers, and I include myself, have been too arrogant. It's not even what you do sometimes, it's the way you treat people in the process of doing it. If your approach is to get a lot of smart people in the room and figure out what these people need and then implement it, the first issue is, who decided that you were so smart?